There's an epidemic in underground music at the moment, an epidemic that's invading every independent venue or community hall across the globe. Every local show is being infested by bands that sound and look exactly like Deftones, with heavy metallic shoegaze combined with overly sensual vocal stylings becoming very difficult to avoid regardless of what subsection of alternative music you may be a part of. Somehow, despite debuting and seeing initial popularity in the 90s, it seems Deftones have become arguably the most important band in terms of the modern day trends utilized in alternative music. Whether these trends be instrumental choices, vocal styles, or even the way in which the band dresses. It's as if Chino Moreno's DNA has been ground into a microplastic paste and inserted into the drinking water of every young music fan across the globe, slowly morphing the average Ed Sheeran concert attendee into some sort of greened out Heshlord goblin wearing the baggiest jorts possible. The Deftones style of music isn't just seeing prevalence within local music scenes, however. Even the heights of underground and alternative music is swarming with bands that play a heavy riff-centric style of shoegaze, obviously taking clear and heavy inspiration from horny tones. Deftones is historically classified as nu metal, a genre label that, although still sees usage today, is making progressively less sense as the years trudge along. If Deftones is nu metal, then surely bands that take clear inspiration like Narrowhead and Fleshwater must be given the same label. This highlights a clear issue with the state of modern music, with the scene being ripe with genre confusion resulting in styles of music being buried beneath a TikTok-themed sludge of overly distorted, reverb-heavy guitar music. It's clear there's something else at play here, with that coming in the form of an equally trendy genre of music known as shoegaze, which not only inspired the music of Deftones, but is continuing to shape the modern music scene in a way that's unlike any other music scene from the past. Before we are able to explore how shoegaze shaped Deftones, therefore causing a ripple effect that has its grips on modern day alternative music, we first need to explore Deftones' explosion onto the scene in the 90s, what made them so appealing, and why the discussion of genre distinction and labels have always been so prominent when yapping about the music and career of Deftones. Let's take a short trip back to the 90s and gaze upon the burgeoning nu metal scene. It was an exciting time. Counterculture was beginning to seep into the mainstream. Skateboarding was a global phenomenon. Bart Simpson and Eric Cartman were plastered all over television, and white metal musicians were beginning to cosplay as stereotypical hip-hop artists whilst beatboxing over shitty groove metal riffs. It truly was a riveting time. Korn's debut self-titled record had just been released. It was heavy and sludgy, simple but groovy, and signalled a change in what metal fans wanted their music to sound like. More importantly, however, it signalled a change in what metal musicians could even look like. Jonathan Davies spearheaded the trend that combined almost every aspect of 90s counter and street culture into a visual style that would quickly become synonymous with the term nu metal. Concurrent to this, a group of Sacramento-raised skaters were also experimenting with heavy sludgy riffs and a healthy amount of hardcore punk influence. This band would eventually be known as Deftones, who would release their debut album Adrenaline to little fanfare in comparison to the immediately successful Korn. The attention towards Deftones would obviously increase with time, eventually resulting in the band being placed amongst nu metal staples such as early Slipknot, Korn and Limp Bizkit by the time the 90s came to a close. So based on this, it's safe to assume that Deftones is nu metal, right? Well, if we take into account the actual sound of the music, no, not really. Deftones is so commonly labelled as nu metal that it's unlikely you even give a second thought to this genre label, but if you think for just 1 second, it makes zero sense. Nu metal was groove metal, hip hop, DJ scratches, horrendous piercings, and the fashion. And let's be honest, Deftones only really fit into 2 of those things. So why were the band given the label of nu metal in the first place? And how does it relate to the Deftones confusion that's plaguing the modern day? The release of Deftones' debut album entitled The Shell One coincided with the explosion of nu metal spearheaded by Korn. The album and therefore band quickly got lumped into the nu metal stew based on an ignorant idea that all heavy music was the same. Adrenaline did utilize down-tuned guitars alongside a certain type of energy, which of course somewhat aligned them with contemporaries such as Korn, but the album was still sonically much different to what nu metal would eventually become. Any nu metal related argument then got completely eradicated with the release of Around the Fur in 1997. The album featured a tonality and subject matter that vastly differed from bands like Cold Chamber in its introspective and emotional qualities. Deftones had quickly become far too emotionally complex and more importantly horny for the average Fred Durst fan to relate to, with White Pony building on this and essentially setting fire to the nu metal relation and leaving it in a dark, dim hole to slowly rot away until a white woman on TikTok finds their dad's adrenaline vinyl and somehow morphs the direction of culture for a good few years. Whilst the rest of the scene were being placed into a box and forced to include record scratches and unfathomably cringe hip-hop sections in their music, Deftones were slowly shaping their own section of alternative metal. Their primary focus strayed away from the heaviness and grooviness of contemporary bands and instead utilized an inherent understanding of depth and emotion effectively within music that was targeted towards a heavy metal audience. Atmospheric melodies were blended with tones that would make any studio engineer soy face, and a vocal style that sounds more so like an early 2000s deathcore vocalist's reaction after seeing a 15-year-old girl at a concert than the typical grunts, shouts and raps of the time. One of Deftones' biggest strengths sonically is their subtlety in terms of both guitar tones, riff writing and Chino's vocal style. It allows the band to build anticipation for certain aspects of the songs, with the build-up always managing to pay off due to the band's vast tonal range and ability to produce riffs that sound satisfying both clean and slow and fast and distorted to fuck. It's like the exact opposite of Sleep Token. This is something nu metal just simply wasn't known for. Deftones is like a moist beachside evening before a spectacular storm, whilst other nu metal is more akin to attempting to drive home in a storm whilst consistently dodging fallen branches, red snapbacks and poorly made Netflix documentaries. So why the f*** were Deftones labelled nu metal? It's clear the hazy, emotional and often sensual sound of Deftones is a far cry from Fred Durst or Jonathan Davis spitting nonsense over hip-hop inspired groove metal tracks. In reality, nu metal was never particularly based on a sound in the 90s. All of a sudden, the record labels had gotten their filthy little mitts on an aspect of metal music that was extremely appealing for a mainstream audience. It started with Korn, with Deftones being lumped into the same mold due to the release of Adrenaline, somewhat coinciding with Korn in terms of time frame. By the time My Own Summer had blasted onto the music scene, the nu metal label had been cemented as a way to describe these hip-hop inspired syncopated metal bands who all just happened to look a certain way. Deftones had a very similar image to their nu metal contemporaries, which resulted in a similar label. If you've watched this channel at all in the past, you're probably sick of hearing me consistently yap about how important visuals are to the business and financial side of music. It is simply just an unfortunate fact that even the most talented bands will be unlikely to succeed without some sort of appealing visual style. This is beginning to improve with the internet making music free and easy to listen to, but in the 90s it was unavoidable. Nu metal thrived on its visual style. It was a style that perfectly coincided with the contemporary countercultural aspects of the 90s. Tony Hawk, Kurt Cobain, everything was slowly becoming a bit more cruddy in the years prior to nu metal. Deftones were perfectly able to align with this, as opposed to being forced to dress like an NWA Andrew Reynolds mashup on stage. They just simply were a group of metalhead skaters from California who were heavily inspired by the culture around them. They were, from the very beginning, just simply nu metal visually, and without even trying were immediately lumped into the nu metal scene. If a band looks the part and sounds the part from the perspective of an elderly white label executive, they will be marketed as that part. After the tragic, although inevitable death of nu metal in the early 2000s, Deftones remained a mainstay within metal and alternative rock. White Pony had become a classic. They had sonically put a stake in the nu metal association for many individuals in the know. They were simply just a good band that utilized various aspects of alternative music in a way that was refreshing and incredibly influential for the next generation. This has of course extended all the way to the modern day. Deftones' ability to remain trendy and interesting even to this day isn't something that's typically seen in metal. Although bands like Metallica or Black Sabbath remain insanely influential upon the entirety of heavy music, these bands have never really been seen as consistently trendy and refreshing throughout each and every decade since. It's as if Deftones are treated like a brand new up and coming band every 5 years or so. I believe this does have a lot to do with the band's sound, alongside their universally appealing image. The band can be considered so many different things genre-wise, which makes them trendy regardless of what may be viral at the time. Whether it be shoegaze, post-hardcore, nu metal, Deftones at some point in their career can be considered as a band that fits into one of these many genres. Although Deftones were incredibly successful in the 90s, their sound and style is most prominent in the modern day, all thanks to a little Chinese platform known as TikTok. It's likely that each and every one of of you are aware of TikTok's role in the promotion and popularity of alternative music, and how it was a vital part of the modern resurgence of Deftones, and therefore the current state of underground music. It's a concept that's pretty impossible to avoid, and let's be honest, it's unlikely you'll be able to spend more than 1 hour on the alternative music section of this platform without hearing the words Deftones and TikTok within the same sentence. And of course, I am very much guilty of this, but at least I don't soy face in every thumbnail. TikTok's influence upon Deftones' popularity is extremely easy to understand. TikTok creators start using snippets of Deftones songs, these posts become viral, more people use the snippet, which results in Deftones reaching more ears and eyes of online listeners, essentially morphing Deftones into a meme and online phenomenon in their own right. It's pretty simple social media analysis. What's harder to understand is why exactly this happened. What separated Deftones from the countless alternative and post-metal artists in the past, and what makes them different from the other trendy, unique bands within other genres, like for example 9 Inch Nails? Why are Deftones so appealing to the chronically online? Well, it's pretty much the same reason as to why Deftones were even considered nu metal in the first place. It's almost entirely based on the image. Well, it is a little bit more than that, but mainly image. Don't get me wrong, nu metal was beginning to bubble upwards into mainstream culture for a good 5 years or so before this person began wearing this outfit. Many of the trendy musicians, rappers and producers of the time had grown up with nu metal bands and were actively beginning to utilize aspects of their sound and style as far back as when Lil Uzi Vert started wearing shit like this. The influence of these artists began to dampen the negative reputation nu metal had, leaving it primed and ready for a resurgence. Visually, nu metal is a perfect fit for a modern trend because it isn't just one thing. Whilst grunge fashion is pigeonholed into just stripy jumpers and fucked up jeans, nu metal takes inspiration and can be so many different things. It's metal, it's hip hop, it's skater, it's rave. It's essentially everything from the 90s that still remains trendy in the modern day. Well, apart from this. To partake in nu metal, you don't need to look ridiculous, which is usually the case in counter-cultural music-related fashion scenes. You can just take small aspects that link themselves to countless different cultures and call it a day. It's more approachable and accessible, much like the music. The music's popularity then goes hand in hand with the fashion. Band t-shirts are of course a big thing, and the idea of being a poser becomes a highly feared prospect. Suddenly, bands more underground than the mainstays like Slipknot, Korn and Limp Bizkit see a resurgence. It just so happens that Deftones is more appealing, accessible and sonically deep than the vast majority of 90s nu metal bands combined. When shit like this becomes trendy, fashion motherfuckers who spend hundreds on non-weather appropriate slop garments start posting fit pics. Celebrities are seen wearing the style whilst being harassed by paparazzi. High-end fashion brands begin dressing their models in Korn tracksuits, and it spreads to more ears and eyes. Most importantly though, it spreads the style to the ears and eyes of consumers and fashion-obsessed freaks that will throw money at anything they consider to be trendy or cool. These fashion motherfuckers control the market more than you'd think. People obsessed with fashion throw endless amounts of money at whatever company is producing their slop. They're willing to spend so much more money to look a certain way. It inspires countless companies, whether these companies be run by just one person or literally be a giant slop factory run by Chinese child labor. They all want a piece of the pie. This continued for a couple years before everyone realized that every single upcoming nu metal band that wasn't from the 90s was awful, apart from this one, and moved on to something else, with the youth choosing to buy slop fashion that attempts to take advantage of another music scene instead. Deftones remained in the zeitgeist, however, mainly due to the fact that they entirely avoid the goofy aspects of nu metal and focus on the cool, universally appealing aspects alongside a sound that is continuously refreshing. It was this side of Deftones that had been inspiring bands for years prior to the recent explosion. Deftones had somehow managed to spearhead a movement in the mid to late 2010s and don't seem to get credited enough for doing so. Bands that began to resemble Deftones sonically began popping up around the mid to late 2010s. Obviously, this included bands like Def Heaven, Basement and Super Heaven that, although were clearly inspired by Deftones, saw enough outside influence and varied elements to avoid the comparison for the most part. They were all being compared to a different genre, a genre that during its birth was as niche as it was complicated, and somehow came to shape an entire generation through its later combination with Deftones. This genre is of course shoegaze, which although occasionally avoids being name dropped specifically, is a genre that's more important today than it's ever been, although differs vastly from what it once was. Historically, shoegaze has always been a genre that's hard to approach or analyze analyze in any normal way, mainly because its creation is solely credited to a man that is far from normal in every way. It's clear the genre stemmed from UK post-punk, with bands like Jesus and the Mary Chain and Cocteau Twins pushing forwards the sonic capabilities of post-punk, although the genre wouldn't be seen as heavy or abstract in any way until the emergence of My Bloody Valentine, who sonically stamped the label of shoegaze with their magnum opus, Loveless. Not only did My Bloody Valentine play much louder than the typical metal band of the time, often resulting in rubble literally falling from the ceiling, they were able to create walls of noise that mogged the vast majority of even the more atmospheric metal subgenres emerging at the time, like black or drone. Although the album is definitely heavy, you'll rarely hear it categorized as such, with the label primarily seeing use for metal and its many subgenres. Due to an obsession with guinea pigs and causing drummers to have catastrophic mental breakdowns, shoegaze got violently kicked to the side of the street and curb stomped by motherfuckers who look like this shortly after its rise to prominence. This meant the sound and style wouldn't see its emergence within America until 4 or 5 years after Kevin Shields went on an extended hiatus from life. It started with bands like Smashing Pumpkins taking the hazy and atmospheric aspects of shoegaze and avoiding all of the vacuum cleaner ambience. This was then incorporated into many of Deftones' projects, which by way of timing, contemporary bands, and a stylish dress code led to shoegaze and nu metal being attached for years to come. During the birth of the two subgenres, shoegaze and nu metal couldn't be further apart in terms of sonic capabilities, techniques behind the creation, and of course the freakazoids that made them possible. Shoegaze's refusal to appeal to mainstream conventions thanks to this little
chinchilla
obsessed schizophrenic made it seem antithetical to a genre such as nu metal, which was continuously pushing towards mainstream success by combining a typically harsh genre such as metal with as many popular 90s trends as possible. Despite this, in the modern day, nu metal and shoegaze seems to be perfectly aligned, with many modern bands playing a weird amalgamation of the two. Heavy shoegaze seems to be commonly played by people who look like this and brag about their immense e-girl coochie collection, as opposed to antisocial British insomniacs. Although Deftones was never really lumped in with shoegaze during their emergence into metal, despite the obvious influence, it's become very obvious in the decades since that a huge section of their sound and therefore appeal is thanks to shoegaze stylings. So why is this? Adrenaline came out 4 years after Kevin Shields' insomnia and mental breakdown fueled creation of Loveless. Why wasn't it clearly credited? Well, shoegaze was very much a British creation. Well, if we ignore the countless Japanese bands that did it 20 years beforehand, but for the sake of this video, we will again ignore Japan. Shoegaze was pushed aside for a more commercially successful Britpop in the 90s and largely forgotten about within Britain, leaving the genre stuck in obscurity. This changed with the birth of the internet, with the music forums allowing for worldwide discussion regarding obscure 90s albums. Suddenly, shoegaze was a sound and style that was being praised, resulting in many bands from the past, such as Deftones, being given the shoegaze stamp posthumously. It's gone to the point where I believe it's safe to say that Deftones are more influential towards modern shoegaze music than the likes of My Bloody Valentine, Slowdive, or even more recent heavier projects like
Sunbather
by Deafheaven. This has in turn created a weird crossover between shoegaze and nu metal, which has resulted in various anomalies in today's music culture. For example, the redundant term newgaze exists, and prominent nu metal and shoegaze artists are often packaged within the same tour or festival, with the most prominent example being Sick New World, before they decided to shit the bed by paying Scientologist scumbags and Lars Ulrich way too much money. Shoegaze's inherent connection towards nu metal goes further than just the musical stylings of Deftones. It's heavily connected to how music culture is continuing to grow, develop, and more importantly, healthily cherry-pick from the alternative genres of the past. What many people ignore about nu metal's monumental online resurgence is the fact that various other underground countercultural genres were seeing a resurgence at the exact same time. The genre that saw its explosion in virality that's most prominent to Deftones is, of course, shoegaze. Artists like Wisp began to explode onto the mainstream on TikTok, with the social media platform being responsible for the vast majority of Wisp's plays, which have reached tens of millions at the time of writing, despite it being incredibly simple music in comparison to early shoegaze. You'd probably assume that this sudden shoegaze explosion would inspire countless individuals online to explore the genre's roots, delving into My Bloody Valentine, Ride, Slowdive, hell, even early Blur. Yeah, that kind of happened, but not really, not with everyone. Even with first wave shoegazer's online resurgence in the 2010s through online forums, these projects were just too niche and difficult to attack for the average dopamine fried TikTok user. The albums of first wave shoegaze don't really contain the typical typical lead single, catchy hook, or even any form of song that could have been considered a hit in the 90s. It's all contained within one typically long and overcumbering album, which just isn't as accessible as the Deftones discography, which is both mainstream friendly and label beloved, ripe with charting hits and head noddable riffs. It's clear that common assumption would just simply link itself to whatever else was popular or trending at the time, which just happened to be nu metal. Deftones were not only the defining band within this nu metal revival, but also prominently featured shoegaze elements throughout their discography. It resulted in the definition of shoegaze being muddied and essentially completely changing. In the modern day, shoegaze is no longer walls of ethereal sound with little vocal melody, for the most part anyway. It's a heavy subgenre that easily aligns itself with pop sensibilities such as hooks or melodic riffs. There is of course music that still resembles first wave shoegaze. Just because I say one thing is prominent doesn't mean something else doesn't exist. It's morphed into a genre that's not only appealing to more mainstream audience members, but also the vast majority of upcoming bands, simply because not many people want to purposely give themselves insomnia over some stupid guitar music. Don't get me wrong, bands like Slowdive are still seeing insane popularity, playing a brand of first wave shoegaze, but it simply just doesn't hold a candle to the success of artists like Deftones or even slowcore artists from a similar generation such as Duster. It's clear classic shoegaze just doesn't resonate with young people as much as music that tastefully uses aspects of its sound alongside other genres. This in turn led to Deftones being celebrated for the shoegaze aspects within their music. Songs previously thought as deep cuts, such as their Smiths cover or the entirety of Koi No You Can, began seeing insane relevance online simply due to their shoegaze aspects. This has led to confusion over what defines nu metal, shoegaze, slowcore, groove metal, and what genres bands inspired by all four can be forcibly shoved into. Deftones are now commonly considered shoegaze, alongside the first wave bands like Ride, and of course alongside various other modern bands that simply just utilize distortion and reverse reverb on top of various other genre stylings within their music. It seems like genre confusion is at an all-time high, which is beginning to restrict the reach of certain bands and artists integral to the history and development of certain styles. In the past 20 years or so, online music culture has always been about meticulously placing projects into very specific molds. God forbid you misgenre an album on /mu in the late 2000s, you'd get verbally massacred. Nowadays it isn't really a thing as much, leading to bands that are vastly different sonically being given the same label. How is it that bands like Title Fight, Basement, Deftones, Superheaven, Typo Negative, and Slipknot can be considered similar enough to be recommended as such on various streaming services? Well, it's because each of these bands saw songs become monumentally popular on TikTok, and it just so happens that algorithms can't tell the difference between different genres of music, and in a world and culture run by algorithms, this is a big problem. In the modern day, algorithms essentially control our lives, what we watch, what we buy, what we are shown, and most importantly, what we listen to. Algorithms are the reason you're watching this video right now, and if you're young enough, it could quite possibly be the reason you're into heavy and alternative music in the first place. This is all well and good if we ignore the heinously dystopian aspects. Algorithms just allow each individual to be suggested the music they are most likely willing to listen to, right? Unfortunately, this just isn't the case, as algorithms are incredibly flawed in the fact that they only take into account the habits and trends of other listeners on a huge scale. As I've explained, fashion, trends, and Deftones have completely skewed what both shoegaze and even nu metal are considered sonically in the modern day. A typical mainstream adjacent shoegaze listener would likely spend their time listening to artists from countless different genres alongside whatever may be trendy on social media at the time. This then tells apps like Spotify that these artists must be the same thing because they are enjoyed by the same people. It's why Spotify suggests bands like Basement, Alex G, Title Fight, and Slipknot to Deftones listeners. Each of these bands differ considerably sonically. They are all essentially in completely different genres, although are listened to by the same people. This may seem like a non-issue, but highlights a problem when it becomes clear the sheer power these services have over what we listen to and therefore what becomes trendy and inspires people. If TikTok didn't exist, it's highly likely Deftones wouldn't have received a resurgence within Gen Z culture, meaning it would still have a fan base consisting primarily of nu metal fans who likely wouldn't link the style to shoegaze in any way. Shoegaze would remain a niche underground genre discussed online, mainly inspiring inspiring first-wave aficionados, or trailblazers such as Def Heaven, who combine styles in a way that literally makes zero sense to insane stylistic results. It's unlikely the sound would have become so important to music in the modern day, and it's likely I would be able to go to a local show or open mic without hearing some motherfucker moan like a freakazoid far too close to their microphone. It's not exactly the consequences of Deftones, it's more so the consequences of how music is presented, regardless of the involvement of social media. Deftones have always been presented in a way that seems strange to their actual sound and art, simply so they could be sold. They weren't really nu metal, but there was financial incentive to label them as such. They aren't really shoegaze, but it's incredibly easy and convenient to shove them within a Spotify created shoegaze playlist. Regardless of the various details surrounding the band, they have still been able to cause an insane dent on music culture. Maybe it isn't entirely by their own doing, but it 100% wouldn't be possible without their consistent trailblazing and sonic evolution. It's vital to their continuous success and constant discussion within alternative scenes. Culture doesn't just take things from the past that are extremely mid and bring them back to the mainstream. Well, actually, that's not true. It happens a lot, but it doesn't have the same impact that Deftones has had. It's usually just one dressing in a certain way thinking it's cool and then it disappears. Deftones has made a huge impact in the modern day, and most trends and bands from the past wouldn't be able to just pop back up again and do bits in the same way Deftones has. Although it seems like I've been gunning towards a highly negative conclusion this entire video, and I'm sure based on the thumbnail you've all been anticipating me dogging on goth girls for 10 more minutes, but if I'm being honest, I don't believe Deftones' consequences upon society are really consequences in the traditional sense. By that I mean, Deftones and the mark they have left can only really be considered a positive. Sure, we can get bogged down by irritating fashion-obsessed trend hoppers and genre confusion that muddies the music discussion waters, but it misses the bigger point. Regardless of what you think about Deftones sonically, their ability to consistently evolve and change their sound is admirable, and something that every musician should take inspiration from. I'm glad Deftones is the main band inspiring up-and-coming musicians. I'd rather hear distorted, heavy reverb-ridden guitars than some with an acoustic guitar that's made its life goal to sing in the most irritating, although completely in-key way possible.